Hello, and welcome to the Semiconductor Industry Association's public webinar series, where we address current issues impacting the global semiconductor industry and market. My name is Falan Yunug. I'm the Director for Industry Statistics and Economic Policy at SIA, and I will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Semiconductor-enabled devices have become increasingly prevalent in developing solutions for numerous problems in the economic and health sphere. This is none more evident than in the medical device sector, in which semiconductor-powered devices have been on the front lines of COVID-19 detection, transmission prevention, and treatment. SIA's recently released white paper, From Microchips to Medical Devices, Semiconductors as an Essential Industry During the COVID-19 Pandemic, outlines the important role semiconductors play in next-gen medical technology and pandemic response and recovery. Here to discuss this important role and growth of semiconductors in the medical device end market are four distinguished panelists. Mr. Paul Pickering is a senior analyst for industrial semiconductors at Omdia, where he conducts research on semiconductor market trends and provides analysis, insights, and forecasts. Mr. Michel Demay is VP and General Manager, Signal Processing, Wireless, and Medical Division, Advanced Solutions Group at ON Semiconductor. He has more than 25 years of experience in the semiconductor industry in leadership, product line management, product definition, SoC design, and SoC design center management. Dr. Trevor Gunn is VP for International Relations at MEDTRONIC, which is the world's largest medical technology company. And finally, we have Ms. Davy Keller, who is Director for Global Policy at SIA. She is responsible for managing SIA's international trade and global policy priorities, including representing SIA in the World Semiconductor Council, a cooperative global body dedicated to promoting a free, open, and globally competitive trading environment for semiconductor products. Paul Pickering, let's start with you to provide us with a brief overview of the medical device market for semiconductors.
Okay, thanks, Falan. It's great to be here with my distinguished colleagues. I'm going to be giving a high-level overview of the semiconductor market in medical electronics. And let's start out with just a very quick view of history. And Falan mentioned that semiconductors are increasingly assuming an important role in medical electronics, but that wasn't always the case. So if we can have the first slide, please. So as you can see here, medical devices have a long history. I'm going to talk a little bit about ventilators, since ventilators are clearly a subject of current interest in the COVID-19 pandemic. Ventilators go back to, as you can see, all the way back to the turn of the last century. Here's a 1907 original, purely mechanical device. And then we go back to the 1960s. We can see Bennett, a PR2, 1963. There was a ventilator there, mostly, of course, mechanical in nature. And now, finally, we take a look at what is a current generation Puritan Bennett 840. This is a system that is widely used in hospitals today. So as you can see, if we go to the next slide, semiconductors are at the heart of this system. This is a block diagram of the Puritan Bennett 840. You can see this particular device has 6 boards on it, printed circuit boards, handling a wide range of semiconductor functions, communications, user interface, pressure solenoids, and so on. And we over at Omdia actually did an analysis of one of Puritan Bennett's products. They actually released a complete design kit as part of the COVID pandemic support in order to help other people produce similar products in a timely manner. And we did analysis of some of the products in there. We turned out they have almost 80 integrated circuits in this device. They have 70 transistors, plus a broad range of other semiconductor devices. So clearly, semiconductors play a crucial role in the operation of not only ventilators, but many, many other semiconductor products. To go on to the next slide. Here, based on our analysis, this is the semiconductor share by category in 2019 for medical devices. you can see that it's fairly evenly split between analog, discretes, logic, memory, microcomponents, optical, and sensors. All of these categories semiconductors have considerable presence in the medical market. So really, it's something that many suppliers participate in with a broad range. And these definitions you see here are actually follow the WSTS definition of semiconductor categories. We go on to the next slide. We can look at the applications. So where are these semiconductors used in the various applications? You can see here that medical imaging is the largest category of semiconductor use, with fully a third of the market by revenue. But nonetheless, I mean, all of the other parts of the semiconductor market, consumer, diagnostic, and medical instruments, all have considerable presences. So what we see is that medical semiconductors are used key parts of numerous categories. In fact, if you look at the semiconductor categories themselves, you'll find that the application-specific categories are the largest in terms of revenues. And these are devices where manufacturers will build a device for a specific application in a medical product rather than a general purpose, for instance, amplifier or voltage reference or something like that. They tend to bundle many parts into a custom product specifically for the application that they're being designed into, what we call application-specific products. And those in both the digital and analog categories, they are the largest by revenue of all the different semiconductors categories, even outpacing such industry standards as voltage regulators. So it's a broad and deep coverage. Next slide. So with regard to COVID-19, what we saw certainly in this year was pretty much what you'd expect. We saw an increase in demand for treatment-related equipment in general, and specifically, of course, ventilators, but also in other areas, patient monitoring equipment, diagnostic equipment, x-rays, computerized tomography or CAT scan units, and so on. Furthermore, we saw some diversion of funds from segments that were not clearly operating to help with the COVID pandemic. For instance, ultrasound and magnetic resonance imaging. In some cases, there were diversions of funds from those, although we have seen more recently, just in industry news, I'm not sure if this has been reflected in revenue so far, that ultrasound, it turns out, is a diagnostic tool that doctors are finding very useful in terms of diagnosing early stages of COVID-19. So in terms of, those are the direct effects. In terms of the indirect effects, in a way, COVID represents an inflection point in how we do many things. You know, you've heard all of these discussions about, you know, work from home and so on and so forth. But in terms of the medical segment, we've seen an increase in telehealth as a result of the postponement or cancellation of routine doctor appointments. We've seen other effects too. An increase side effects, including increase in sales of portable equipment that enables some of these remote operations to take place. And finally, you know, they say the market hates uncertainty, and that is true in the medical device field. I'm sure some of my colleagues will speak to that. But anytime there's uncertainty, especially if we're not sure at the other end of the tunnel what the medical market is going to look like, we are seeing some pausing of investments, not only in, again, you know, my colleagues can talk to this, not only in the medical equipment manufacturing segment, but also in the semiconductor segments too. We've seen some diminution in expansion plans of the pure play semiconductor foundries, for example, due to the general uncertainty around the pandemic. Next slide. Nonetheless, though, we see long-term trends are positive for semiconductors. The bottom line is once we get over the pandemic, population demographics, people are aging as the world population, the average age is going up, and that will lead to large numbers of resources being diverted or being allocated to take care of the needs of an aging population. We've already talked about telehealth, we can talk about aging in place. And in general, you know, medical equipment is getting replaced, and newer equipment, as we're also seeing, has increased semiconductor content relative to the devices it replaced. Apart from anything else, newer equipment tends to be portable, tends to have wireless connectivity, things that perhaps the older equipment did not have. So also in the broader ecosystem, the growth of AI as a tool in medical electronics, medical diagnostics is going to increase, and portables and wearables, everybody's familiar with some of the stuff you can get down at the local pharmacy in terms of portable and medical devices, and non-medical devices are being added to consumer devices. I'm sorry, medical functions are being added to consumer devices, such as smartwatches, fitness bands. All of those have some of these ASICs that we talked about incorporated in them. And finally, increase in portables and wearables. That has implications for increasing semiconductors, specifically in the low power, high efficiency design areas. They'll be mounted in smaller size packages, which also tends to cause manufacturers to go to increased integration. And I already mentioned wireless connectivity. So if you look at this slide here, you'll see that although you know, there has been some fairly dramatic volatility in terms of growth over the last couple of years, you know, first due to the China-US trade war, and now due to the pandemic. Nonetheless, if you look at the trend line there, you'll see that the long-term trend for semiconductors is very promising, and something that we will continue to follow and report as necessary. I think that was my last slide.
Great. Thank you for that very helpful overview, Paul. Really appreciate that. I'm sure we'll get to some of the market dynamic questions in the Q&A. But before we do, I want to move on to Michelle DeMay. Michelle, you work on the forefront of developing chips that enable life-saving medical devices at ON Semiconductor. From a chip producer's point of view, you know, hopefully you can tell us a bit more about how semiconductors that you created on help enable life-saving medical devices in this very interesting and dynamic market.
Thank you, Fallon. I will be happy to do so. Good morning, everybody. Fallon, can you show the first slide, please?
Hold on one second. Let me get to the right screen. Oh, no. Hold on. Here you go.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So you can immediately go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk too long about ON Semiconductor, but I do, for the audience, wanted to give a quick introduction. ON Semiconductor is a public company. The headquarters are in Phoenix, Arizona. I am not based in Phoenix, Arizona. The headquarters of the medical division are in Waterloo, Ontario, so I'm calling from Canada. We have like 34,000 employees globally. Based on 2019 revenue numbers, we're a $5.5 billion company. And if you look at the diverse product portfolio, medical semiconductors would be captured in the industrial segment. If you go to the next slide, we will start focusing on the medical semiconductor market. As Paul already mentioned, you can categorize the medical devices in certain areas. And the way I want to present it here, ties a little bit also into the risk management that is associated with these devices. We have over-the-counter devices. We have some of them at our own house. They're thermometers, blood pressure monitors, heart rate monitors. They have much more affinity with what I would refer to as consumer devices than the really life-critical medical devices. There is medical imaging. Those are very big machines with a lot of content, like ultrasound, X-ray, MRI scanners. They have very specialized solutions, very high-speed converters in there, specialized business. We have the medical devices, and they range from implantable devices, pacemakers, neurostimulators. You have hearing aids, pulse oximetry meters, DFIPs, ECG, etc. And then you have the devices that the primary use is actually in hospitals. For instance, a ventilator would be part of that. If you go to the next slide, please. I want to give a little bit of an overview of the trends that we are seeing on Semiconductor. And to be able to translate the trends into medical semiconductor trends, we kind of like to start with market drivers and trends that we see. First of all, we're aging. The population is aging. The fastest growth rate in aging population is now above 85 years old. We're expecting to have a quality of life longer than what we used to do. There is an increase of incidence of heart disease, diabetes, asthma. In general, people are more interested in how they are doing, what their health is, they're interested in wellness. And there is also, when we get ill or when we want to see the doctor, there is a shift to outpatient monitoring. There is a shift to home health care. And we also have seen now under COVID times that a doctor's appointment can happen from the privacy of your home. And then a third trend that we see is that there is an increased healthcare expenditure, and there are also health insurance reforms. So what do we think that translate into medical device trends? Well, first of all, we're seeing that medical devices will have an increased amount of intelligence, more computational power, and more memory, more data storage. There's more analytics to be done. There is more data to be captured and stored to be used at a certain moment in time. And whether that is real time or whether this is after a download by your physicist, that depends a bit on the device. We also, we see portability, we see wireless connectivity, and we see smartphone interfaces. And so those trends of these medical devices now translate into trends for the semiconductors, the chips that we make. And one of them is greater integration. You will see that medical devices will now tend to go to smaller geometries. Smaller geometries to give the more signal processing, microcontroller capabilities, as well as the storage of larger memory. Since the devices need to be portable, there is a miniaturization. And with miniaturization comes also power efficiency, because when a solution is power efficient, it allows you to use smaller batteries. It allows you to eventually do energy harvesting. And those kind of things lead to better portability and smaller solutions. And then, of course, embedded wireless functionality. And also there is the direction to almost put the electronics, or put the electronics in patches, something that you put on your body. It does the diagnose, it transmits your numbers, and so those solutions are disposable. So those are and that's why we call this slide is called Medical Innovation is Getting Personal, because one of the biggest trends is, as we are aging, we want to have a quality of life. We don't want to spend too much time in hospitals. We want to be able to do that from home. Next slide, please. And this is a slide that captures, and I'm referring also to the Semiconductor website here, to the medical solutions, and I'm highlighting the different categories. So we have portable medical devices. They are measuring. They let you be more mobile. They would do diagnose, but they also would do drug delivery. There are an increasing amount of solutions that will aid with whether it's now insulin delivery or another drug delivery, whether that is subcutaneously or through the skin. Medical imaging is where we have the really fast high-end A to D converters that are going into machines that have thousands of these devices just to have a clear picture of the patient. In clinical point of care, there we put glucose monitoring. We also have elements like minimal non-invasive genomic diagnosis. And so that's a point of interest where we allow better diagnose. In audiology, so basically the hearing aids, one of the things that we want to highlight is that hearing loss is a silent problem, and it most oftenly goes untreated for years, and that has additional repercussions. Recent studies have demonstrated that when you have untreated hearing loss, there is a significantly higher risk. There are higher rates of psychosocial disorders, such as depression and anxiety, and there is a higher risk of developing dementia. And so hearing aids the hearing aid market is underserved. And that's something that is very dear to our heart, and where we have very good solutions that our customers then use technologies like artificial intelligence, but also looking at your movements, seeing if you talk, if you connect with other people, and kind of drive towards behavioral modification there. And then in patient monitoring, that's a market that we serve typically by specific solutions for a customer. On the next slide, and Paul already highlighted this, I'm going a little bit deeper here. So this is a block diagram of a medical ventilator, and we have a number of products that applications. We have block diagrams that you can find on our website. I highlighted the medical ventilator. It has a microcontroller. Where you do basically the control of how to pump the air into the lungs and get it back out. There is a brushless DC drive control unit that basically drives the pumps. There are valve drive circuitry where you control where the air is going. You have user interfaces. Some of them can be touch screen. Other ones are to give instructions, voice user interface, but also give audio signals to the user. And then there is a block where there is a power supply management, because at the end these devices they're supplied by the mains, and that those signals need to be converted. And if you look at this block diagram, and we tallied it up, there are 8 subsystems. In every of these subsystems, Semiconductor has content, and summarizing it, we have. In a ventilator, we have a total of 85 different components. They're coming out of different factories. They're coming out of a complicated supply chain, and that's just the devices from Semiconductor. And that's where, when we saw a big increase in demand, we had to put specific business continuity teams in place to make sure that our customers who are building these devices, which are in critical need, have been able to get the components that they needed under circumstances where also we had a workforce that had to be shelter in place or has spent their days in our factory to make sure that we can source these components. If you want to know more about it, there's also an interesting blog from Stephen Dean, and I've indicated the link there. And so with that, I would go to the next and my last slide. So I hope I've been able to demonstrate that semiconductor components are ubiquitous in medical devices. The semiconductor devices, they range from standard components. This can be a diode. This can be a grouping of 2-3 transistors that provide protection or drive to actuators, to very specialized application-specific integrated circuits that are developed to work with a specific sensor of a specific customer to do certain types of sensing in and around the body. And they can have a high level of customization, high level of integration and innovation. The bill of materials for medical devices, they range from tens of semiconductor components to several thousands. In the very complicated devices that, like an MRI machine. And to conclude, on semiconductor and our operations have been deemed essential and critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security. And that has allowed us to be able to be in a position that we could support our customers, the medical device companies that on their end then needed to support our society as we were struggling through COVID-19. And so with that, I want to leave it. Thank you, Fallon.
Well, thank you, Michel. I really appreciate it. I'm always fascinated when we have the opportunity to talk with member company folks such as yourself who are actually making these innovative devices and components that help power medical devices. So just fascinating stuff that you and your colleagues are doing at ON. We're also fortunate to have Dr. Trevor Gunn with MEDTRONIC, which is the world's largest medical technology company, to give us some thoughts on the importance of semiconductors from a consumer point of view. So why don't I go ahead and get your slides ready and share those with folks, and then I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Fallon, thanks very much, and thanks to SIA for the opportunity to present on the topic. And first of all, I'm not an engineer, so please don't require engineering type skills in some of the questions you may ask. I'm also presenting on behalf of AdvaMed, the world's largest medical technology association. Work very closely with SIA in some joint areas, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And by the way, thanks to Paul and Michel, because they've done a lot of the things that I was thinking of talking about. And maybe I can provide a little bit more clarity on some points. Some points I'll maybe hop over a little bit. I'll certainly be able to provide you some graphics. So we can go to the next. Okay, so a lot of confusion as to what a medical device is. I know that may sound nutty to some people here on the call, but this is a constant issue of public policy that we deal with around the world. Some of them obviously are more intelligent than others here, but certainly all do classify. We can go on to the next. So if you look at the industry writ large, the medical technology industry is a very crude characterization of the industry. MEDTRONIC, though we're the largest in the industry, we really play in the right top hand corner here, where the implantable space, right? Largest producer of stents, we're the largest producer of cardiac rhythm devices. But you do have other great players there, Boston Scientific, Abbott, but you see other players along that have been mentioned already. Elekta from Sweden, Varian in the process of being acquired by Siemens in the capital equipment therapeutic space. And then you have the big, we call them the big steel. Hopefully they don't mind that term, the GEs and the Philips and the Siemens, primarily diagnostic, primarily capital equipment. Needless to say, MEDTRONIC plays in pretty much all these spaces also, but we're primarily in the right-hand top corner, so you have that. Okay, thank you, Paul. I'll go very quickly here. I think a lot of people made some really great arguments about the importance of the industry to addressing a lot of very critical public health care we talked about, but I think deserves further emphasis around disability. Certainly aging populations was called out, better patient outcomes. And then, I mean, at the end of the day, we're having that person get out of the hospital, and back to work, back to their family is the critical thing. That little unit in the top, the bottom left-hand corner is something called the PB560, and I think our colleague Paul actually referenced it. I trust that he does know that Puritan Bennett is a Medtronic company today, so I'm very, very happy that you demasked our company and some of its history already. That is the technology on which we did let go intellectual property on. That is actually in commercial production, but at the same time we let go our intellectual property on that particular device in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And we have approximately 250,000 institutions globally that have downloaded those drawings. Very interesting stuff. There's a lot of other places where we add value on the right-hand side, but I'll go to the next slide. Right. One of the biggest problems we have, actually, I know this is strange for people in SIA and maybe strange for some in the industry, is the confusion of our industry with the pharmaceutical industry. How did we get here? I'll leave this slide to you all, and I'll be happy to share these slides. We can go to the next slide. Because at the end of the day, we actually are much, much more like information technology. I feel very comfortable talking at a very high level around semiconductors, microelectronics, and the relation of the traditional IT industry to our industry. Because frankly, if you understand, if you're a government leader in a faraway place, perhaps countries that don't have any information technology and or medical technology production, if you understand how the IT ecosystem works, you understand largely how the advanced medical technology industry works. And I do want to point out one particular point to the bottom. In the bottom, we worked together with SIA and other actors. We were able to get a lot of our devices classified. In fact, insulin pumps, neuromodulators, cardiac rhythm devices, all these things that were referenced by Paul and Michelle before, included in the information technology agreement under the World Trade Organization. And now, of course, we have something called the WTO e-commerce negotiations, where we're actually very involved. And again, we're making some of these same points and then more when it comes to data, when it comes to the broader information technology world. We can go to the next. Okay, so who is this company called MEDTRONIC? There you have our statistics. A couple you don't have here, we're a $30 billion revenue line. We make approximately 131,000 as the final producer of 131,000 SKUs. Another statistic that maybe isn't represented here is that we have upstream suppliers about 50,000. And if you think about Boeing, Airbus, they are in the range of 20 to 22,000 upstream suppliers. There's a lot of other things we can say, but let's move on because time is, okay. So we're loosely divided into 4 major categories. You can see them here. We can go to the next slide. Now, I was taking some fancy photography this morning with some of the devices. Let's make sure that we understand what these are. On the left-hand side, this is a cardiac defibrillator. It's, well, somewhat similar to the external defibrillator, except that it's implanted. And it has very much similar microcircuitry to the one that's in the middle. That is a traditional pacemaker. We have a much smaller pacemaker that we're producing today, but you can't see as clearly sort of the microcircuitry that's in it. And of course, to the right, that which is not revealed is obviously the battery, which generally speaking in that particular model has battery life between 5 and 7 years. However, the much smaller model called the MEDTRONIC Micra has battery life in the range of 10 to 12 years. Once implanted. By the way, some of you also mentioned the neurostimulator, deep brain stimulation. That is our invention. So thank you guys so much for that great promotion. That big unit to the right-hand side in that picture on the table is for deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease, for essential tremor, many different neurological diseases, frankly, that are not well served by drugs or partially only served by drugs. And one thing, although we're talking about semiconductors here, I do want to call out to our colleagues on the battery side, because most say, and I've reason to believe that this is actually objectively true, is that we have the most advanced battery manufacturing facility in the world in a place called Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. So safely guarded, I can only get a couple little pictures that folks felt comfortable with, and that's the facility there. About 1,000 people in the manufacturing of our batteries that then go into these devices. We outsource a lot of batteries outside, as well, and some of the more capital goods, but the ones that are usually implanted in the body, we're usually going to be sourcing our batteries from ourselves and ourselves only. Okay, follow? All right, so so the gem in the crown, in my view, is a facility called the MEDTRONIC Microelectronics Center. It used to be by a bunch of, it's in Tempe, Arizona, as Michelle may know. It was started by a bunch of Motorola engineers. We can go to the next. Again, this is what they produce. These are some of these devices, a little bit more graphic for you. Some of these are monitoring, but largely MEDTRONIC is in the therapeutic space. You see other devices that have been referenced by my colleagues, the diabetes insulin pump, the constant glucose monitoring system, the cardiac monitoring device. Even I think Michelle or Paul may have mentioned the drug delivery pump and the RTG drug pump on the right-hand side. This is infusing a drug called baclofen, which is made by Novartis, into the cerebral spinal fluid for spasticity, for multiple sclerosis, also for cerebral palsy, areas where the drugs, whether they're ingested or actually put in through the muscle, would actually not have the effect or would be vomited up. So we can go to the next. Yep, and this is, again, just a little bit more about our facility in Tempe, Arizona. By the way, that little device that looks like a pill on the far left-hand side is our micro pacemaker, literally the size of a pill today, and that's the one I referenced earlier before. We can go to the next. Okay. AI was referenced before. We relate as an industry, we relate as a company to all of these areas, and then more. This was actually a slide that we took from a presentation we just held for about 80 countries at the World Trade Organization for people to understand how we actually relate to some of the broader themes in information technology. No, time is short, we can go to the next. And then there's the Puritan Bennett 980, which is it's a little bit more advanced than the 840 that Paul talked to you about before. But this is a partnership actually with Intel Corporation. Some of you may know, in fact, we actually share a joint chairman. Dr. Omer Yishrak is both chairman of Intel Corporation, but also chairman of MEDTRONIC, immediately former CEO. Okay, we can go to the next. Just a couple of these examples. And then you have the insulin pump that we referenced. We can go to the next example. And then finally, somebody mentioned this, but I really want to call out this whole issue of virtual training and education. Before COVID-19, about 95% of our training and education that primarily is for physicians and clinicians was oriented that you would only be able to deliver this in person. Today, about 95% of that training is actual virtual. We think this may stay for a lot longer. So all elements of that new training and education infrastructure will probably outlast and be a constant demand for the semiconductor industry, the microelectronics industry. Next slide, please. Coming right to the end, I know you're gonna all ask us questions about COVID-19. We've lived it like you all have for the past several months. I think hopefully these 4 points are self-explanatory. We've responded to in many different ways. We can go to I think the final slide, which is my contact information. You've got my direct phone number there. You've got my direct telephone number. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you have that aren't answered here. Sorry for my quick pace, and back to you, Fallon.
Oh, no, appreciate it. Thank you, Trevor. Again, fascinating stuff. Want to turn over lastly to you, Davey Keller of SIA. Obviously, trade policy in general seems very important given global nature of both the producers on semiconductor and others, semiconductor producers, and the consumers, customers such as MEDTRONIC. Wonder if you could touch upon policies that you think would be needed to ensure that these types of cutting edge chips that Michelle mentioned get to customers such as MEDTRONIC and ultimately to frontline healthcare professionals and patients to provide quality care and ultimately improve health outcomes.
Sure, thanks, Fallon. And I'll just end, very quickly with a couple high-level messages and especially recommendations for policymakers. I think, everyone realizes that, how important semiconductors are to goods like computers and laptops and phones, but it's not really well understood how prevalent semiconductors are, increasing prevalent in developing solutions for economic and healthcare problems that we've seen in light of the COVID pandemic. And that actually, semiconductors and their supply chains are really important to pandemic response and recovery. And I think we've heard from our other panelists here just how prevalent they are in medical devices, the increasing content in some of these, and I think when you take that into account, we're also semiconductors are also very fundamental to other aspects of response and recovery for this pandemic, but also healthcare in general. And that's not very well understood. We're all in the midst of this COVID pandemic now. Governments have been struggling to adjust their strategies. They've imposed, in March, they've imposed shutdowns, business closures. Many of them have made exceptions for essential industry like medical devices and healthcare, but some have not really realized how integral the semiconductor supply chain is to some of these more essential goods. So while some countries with a strong semiconductor presence in March did specifically identify the semiconductor industry as essential and allowed business operations to continue, some didn't, and that did impact supply chains and production of semiconductors, which in turn impacted the supply chains of downstream customers like medical device makers. We saw that early in April and May. We were actually contacted by a consultant on behalf of ventilator manufacturers who were struggling to find parts to actually build ventilators. So I think the other panelists were kind of really honing in on the important role semiconductors play to medical devices. And as we've put together a white paper, as Falon mentioned, that really outlines the ways, both obvious and non-obvious ways, that the role that semiconductors play in healthcare and economic solutions. And I think the key message for policymakers, given the information shared by my fellow panelists, is that semiconductor supply chains are essential to pandemic recovery and response. And that, as policymakers formulate strategies, they should prioritize semiconductor supply chains as essential because they support these other essential downstream industries. If you look at the white paper, we outline a couple of key recommendations for policymakers. So one is issuing guidance for essential industries. The top recommendation is that the semiconductor industry and its supply chain be included. There were some guidance, for example, the US CISA guidance that did specifically identify semiconductor design and manufacturing, as well as all of its supply chain operations, as essential. A few other recommendations that policymakers can take to ensure continued operations of semiconductor companies and suppliers is to work with the local governments to make sure that there is coordination there and to ensure any necessary registrations for essential business is done in a timely manner. So even though national guidance may be issued, there are differences among local interpretations and registration. So, working closely, between local and national governments would also be helpful. Because our industry is also so global and, traded across borders, increased customs capacity with expedited service to transport semiconductor and supply chain goods, that's also really important in making sure that semiconductor components can get to the customers and be part of and integrated into downstream medical devices. So these are, and allowing essential travel of international, it's allowing essential international travel of essential workers to maintain operations. So I know, in the beginning of the pandemic, we did work with governments, the global industry. We actually issued some global industry statements on the importance of semiconductors and the essential nature. I think it's timely now to have this discussion now as fall is coming around and we are seeing a spike in cases, and we're seeing some more border restrictions and movement control restrictions. So this is a good timing to remind all policymakers and all stakeholders just how essential semiconductors can be to the medical device industry. So that's it, a couple high level messages, and I'll stop there.
Oh, okay, great. Well, appreciate it, Debbie, with that overview. And I commend to folks the recent white paper that Debbie authored on medical devices and markets for semiconductors and the COVID-19 experience. We are going to move into quick Q&A for the last portion of our webinar here, and do encourage folks to send in questions for our panelists. I did want to follow up quickly with you, Davey, about you outlined very nicely the various policy recommendations that that policymakers globally should enact to be sure that these markets stay free and open. And I wanted to just get from your point of view, having gone through and experienced sort of the restrictions that occurred back in the springtime with when the pandemic really hit. And as you mentioned, perhaps ones that may occur in the future with a potential increase again this fall and winter. What of these recommendations have been particularly important that we be sure get resolved in terms of policy issues, and also which of these policy restrictions have been particularly challenging to ameliorate, if you will, to be sure that the markets stay free and open?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, early on, in the spring was, while some governments, they rightly recognized, medical device and healthcare sector as essential and kept those open, they didn't realize the full extent of the supply chain operations. And, there was, is it essential or is it not? They closed some facilities that make parts that go into medical devices. So I think that was the key thing, is the key challenge is the entire semiconductor supply chain, because it's so global and because shortages in one region can directly impact shortages in others, that it's important that the semiconductor supply chain, the semiconductor industry across its supply chain, allows its operations to continue. So I think that's the number one message for policymakers, is that the entire supply chain needs to stay open as essential to these other critical essential sectors. I think that we did experience some issues in some regions, but because of the concerted efforts by global industry, we were able to speak as one voice and talk with regulators around the world. I think that they did eventually realize that. But as we prepare for future crises, and as governments kind of think about the strategies that worked, that didn't, that this definitely should be something that they consider for future crises.
Got it. Thanks. A question for Michelle, maybe also for Paul as well, regarding the market in particular for medical devices, semiconductors. Compared to semiconductors designed and produced for other end markets, whether it's communication devices or laptops, are there unique specifications that are required by medical device customers? Or even governments for that matter, such as regulatory authorities, given that these are products that are going to be powering health and safety. If you could talk maybe a bit about that, Michelle, and maybe Paul, that would be helpful. You guys operate and understand all various types of end markets for semiconductors.
Okay, well, thanks, Fallon. Well, the short answer to that is yes, there are specific requirements and constraints, and they come both from our customers, from the medical device companies, as well as translations of what government requirements are stipulating. We mentioned already that first there's a definition of a medical device. When a device has a certain intended use, it will or will not be qualified as a medical device. Assume it's qualified as a medical device. As an example, if you look at the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration will ask you as a medical device component manufacturer to classify your device into basically three levels of classification, 1, 2, 3. An example, a manual toothbrush would be a class 1 medical device. A ventilator is a class 2 medical device, and a pacemaker would be a class 3. And those classes represent the risk that is associated with the usage of the medical device. If you look at the class 3 medical devices, in the product life cycle, whether it's in the development, the characterization, the evaluation, and the manufacturing, there are specific requirements that you need to adhere to. During the development, you have to work with risk management tools that allow you to do failure analysis, things like design failure mode effect analysis. System FMEAs are required. In the EDA tool world that you use to develop these chips, you would do fault simulation technologies. You would target enhanced test coverage. There are certain requirements in terms of how you characterize the device, corner lots, etc. In some cases, we make sure that there is die-level traceability. So that would mean that a single device in a single piece of equipment has a unique ID that then can be traced back all the way to its manufacturing process, so that we can very quickly, together with our customers, if there would be an issue, identify what the issue was and what are the other components that are affected. And then there is also an increased level of documentation and record keeping. So I think that's a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. And it's not complete, but there are definitely additional requirements.
Definitely. Paul, do you want to comment on the unique nature of the market compared to other markets for semiconductors?
Yes. This medical device, I mean, we looked at the Puritan, and by the way, I'm aware that Puritan Bennett is part of MEDTRONIC, which is why I picked those devices to highlight. But one of the interesting things we noticed when we were looking at that is medical device manufacturers, unless you're talking about things like hearing aids, which incidentally was the largest single segment in our end applications for semiconductors in terms of revenue, and Michel obviously knows a lot about that market. One of the things we noticed was that the volumes are quite small, certainly for pieces of equipment. MEDTRONIC, for example, said that they were building in the tens of thousands. They had a press release, tens of thousands of ventilators per year, which really, in the scheme of things, compared to cell phones and automobiles, tens of thousands is very, very small. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, medical manufacturers need to maintain, it's very difficult, as Michel pointed out, to qualify these devices and keep them and meet all the various regulations. So therefore, once you have, let's say, a microcontroller in a medical device, you really don't want to change it, if at all possible. And so they don't. And so what we've seen is that if you have small volumes, you're a little bit at the mercy of manufacturers for general purpose products, let's say a microcontroller, so to make sure that the semiconductor manufacturer doesn't discontinue your product 5 years into your product life, because in the big scheme of things, you're only doing small volumes. And this is a problem that's common across pretty much all industries. And so what we've noticed in some of the analysis that we've done is that some medical manufacturers tend to use automotive grade parts, because automotive grade parts typically are built in the millions, and the automotive manufacturers require a 20-year product life cycle, a guarantee, because you produce a car and then the car might have a 10-year product life, and after that you have to produce replacement parts for 10 more years. So it makes sense, if you think about it, for medical manufacturers to leverage this to their own advantage. So we noticed, it was kind of struck when we looked at the MEDTRONIC device, it had a number of automotive grade parts in there. And first of all, we thought, wow, that's strange. And then we thought, well, that makes complete sense from the purpose, from a relatively small volume manufacturer who has, nonetheless, to have a guaranteed supply of those products for an extended period. So, there are areas that may not be immediately obvious to some of the restrictions and some of the constraints that medical manufacturers have, but nonetheless are just as real. You know, and now especially since the FDA is now taking a close look at software, clearly a ventilator has a lot of software that controls every function, as my colleagues have discussed. And that's something else that if you start making changes to software, it doesn't matter whether you're doing a product enhancement or because your underlying microcontroller went away, that's a real problem for a medical manufacturer. So I think there are a lot of different things bearing on how you source parts and how you have to get them qualified.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for questions from the audience. I see we've gotten a few. I'm going to try to address them in the time we have. There's been a couple that I think maybe, Trevor, you may be best suited to answer, and they relate to FDA approval process. One in particular, I guess FDA has taken recent actions to speed up the medical device approval process. I assume probably because of, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to get access to essential devices, especially consumer medical devices. What is the current situation on liabilities for device manufacturers, or just, so what is this, how is this, if you can give us sort of an update on how approvals have maybe been accelerated because of the need in the United States for access to these products?
So I'm going to be able to be maybe generally helpful when it comes to this particular comment. Well, first of all, I mean, you know, you can just imagine all of a sudden we had one manufacturing location to multiple contract manufacturing locations around the world. We have manufacturing in Vietnam today. We have manufacturing starting up at a Foxconn plant in Wisconsin that we didn't have before, Bangladesh, and a few others that Bayless up in Canada, in fact, as well. All different types of relationships, all different types of manufacturing. So I would just simply say that I think that there was at times that I thought attitudinally, sometimes the FDA it was a great experience. Let me just put it in those terms, where you had people really, everyone anteing in, everyone really trying to help, everyone really trying to really ask, you know, what could we be doing more of in order to get you to the market quicker, and that those are all the right questions. I mean, there are, just like with FDA trial, you know, some of the trials with different vaccines, there are still policies and procedures. They can move more quickly, but time takes what time takes. But I would just generally say that FDA has been incredibly helpful in this particular process. They obviously have about 1,000 people at the CDRH, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And I would say have been very helpful on the downstream piece of the picture. We manufacture about 110 different types of technologies in the respiratory space, not just ventilators, right? So ECMO machines, which are closer to open heart surgery, and other devices like pulse oximeters, which were referenced before. So they've been generally helpful across the entire spectrum. And to be honest, so have other governments in the world, everyone really trying to do the best in this very difficult time. I can't speak to the issue of liabilities. I'm sorry, I don't have any particular experience, and wouldn't be right for me to comment particularly about our regulator in that context.
Sure. No, appreciate the that helpful response. We're getting close to the end of the hour. I do have and we do have other questions. I'm sure we could talk for another hour or so about this. It's pretty interesting, this segment of the market. I do have one question, and I think it's really one last question. It's really for Michelle, Paul, and Trevor, because I guess you guys are sort of following the market and future trends. If you could, you know, maybe putting on your futurist hat and think of one or two areas or types of innovations that you see semiconductors enabling in the medical device space long term. You know, this is just a fascinating issue. You know, what, like 20, 30, 40 years down the road are we going to be seeing, like in terms of hospitals? You know, you think of like Star Wars and robots, you know, operating on people. I mean, seriously, I mean, what can we expect in terms of health and medical innovations long term?
So I will go first, Fallon. So I think that you will see an evolution in further evolution in drug delivery systems. They also remote patient monitoring and diagnostics, and they will be aided with artificial intelligence. I think there was a question on the forum on artificial intelligence. I think this ties also into the IoT discussion. And will you do edge computing? Meaning then that your neural network and your artificial intelligence will have a function on the edge, basically on the device that you wear on your body, or will that be in the cloud? And I think with good connectivity, it will be both. Certain elements will be done at the edge of the infrastructure and on the body. Other ones will be done in the cloud, and that I think is something that will help data mining, will help diagnosis, and eventually will drive behavior modification. And I think the other thing that I'm seeing and predicting is that medical devices will have an increased focus on mental health and helping people to deal with mental health issues.
Right. Paul, Trevor, any thoughts on the future? We have Dr. robots in our hospitals anytime soon, powered by semiconductors.
I'm happy to comment. I mean, I think the trends here are, smaller devices, much greater longevity, as I mentioned, for example, on the pacemaker. I think you're going to see, robots are already there. We already have a robotic system that aids the spinal surgeons do spinal surgery called Mazor. We have also made quite clear our plans to do a big for surgery around the abdominal cavity, a system that we hope will soon be approved by the respective regulators, et cetera. Can't make any comments really more than that, but we're going to see so many interesting things coming out of the medical technology. I often feel like some industries are at the end of their runway. I feel like we're still in the hangar. We're certainly in the garage when it comes to the medical technology industry. Two things will come out in the next time. I'll be very direct about that. Renal denervation, right? You have an issue around the world around hypertension right now. For the most part, the only response is drugs. We're very hopeful that we'll have a renal denervation device that will basically denervate the nerves going into the kidney to be able to control hypertension, which can't be controlled by drugs. And then also people have talked, hemodialysis is something we haven't talked a lot about. You think the hemodialysis today, I think the massive amounts of water, it's a stationary situation where you have to come to major capital, it's a major capital equipment expenditure in usually an apartment or an office building. Well, we predict, or more than predict, and I guess the scientific literature will guess that we're moving towards hemodialysis, probably moving to the home as a broad trend, and we'll be playing very directly into that, and which will allow access to hemodialysis for rural communities in almost a portable sense. So a lot of really interesting things coming up. Yeah.
Paul, you got the last word. Last 10 seconds. Any future predictions?
Yes, I think a lot of the things that the other panelists talked about are already here in many ways. I mean, we're certainly seeing robotic surgery using augmented reality is already starting to make its way into hospitals. I think one thing that Michel talked about was improved drug delivery. I think we're going to start seeing things like blockchain technology, and is going to allow complete traceability of drugs from manufacturer to patient. I think we're going to see the IoT will play a part in cold chain logistics. In other words, you'll be able to monitor the temperature of vaccines, for example, at every point in real time to make sure that no vaccine, if it works when it leaves the manufacturer, will also work by the time it gets to some remote location. So I think there's a lot of exciting things coming along. And AI, they're already looking at this field called computational biology. They did that with analysis of the COVID-19 effects to try and determine possible diagnostic treatments. We're also seeing AI used in radiology, which has been going on for a couple of years to help radiologists interpret X-rays. So I think the role of semiconductors is obviously key to all those areas and will play an increasing role going forward. So hopefully in a year or two, we can have this discussion again. We have a lot more exciting things to talk to you about.
Exactly. Well, the future may be uncertain, but in this space, it certainly seems pretty bright. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, Paul Pickering, Michelle DeMay, Trevor Gunn, and Davey Keller, really appreciate your time today. And thank you very much for a very insightful webinar.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
Yeah.